Bienvenue à la dernière séance de la série de conférences en informatique cognitive. Ça me fait plaisir d'accueillir Ron Sun, professeur de sciences cognitives au Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute à l'État de New York, qui étudie, modélise et simule les agents cognitifs humains, y compris leur capacité à apprendre, à raisonner et à agir dans le monde réel. Ces recherches peuvent être grossièrement classées dans les principaux domaines suivants: les architectures cognitives, les modèles connexionnistes et hybrides, donc neurosymboliques, ainsi que simulation sociale cognitive et sciences sociales cognitives. Il a une page web que vous pouvez récupérer avec le mot-clé Clarion et Rensselaer. Il va nous parler des architectures cognitives et du rôle crucial de la motivation. Il va chercher à lier les besoins intrinsèques, les objectifs et l'effort avec la performance. Avec ça, with that, I'm happy to welcome Professor Sun for Rensselaer, and I pass the driver's wheel to him.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction, although I have no idea what you just said.
It was your own words, but in French.
Okay. So I would like to discuss the crucial role of motivation in cognitive architectures, trying to link intrinsic needs with goals, actions, and performance. How do I advance the slide? It doesn't seem to want to advance. Okay, so what is motivation? According to a New Oxford American Dictionary, reasons one has for acting or behaving in a particular way, the general desire or willingness to do something. According to Merriam-Webster Dictionary, it's something that causes a person to act, such as a need or desire. Actually, what I like most, to my surprise, is the one from Wikipedia. It says motivational states are commonly understood as forces acting within the agent that create a disposition to engage in goal-directed behavior. So there are a lot of different things that are involved here. On the one hand, you have need, desire, disposition, willingness, and on the other hand, you have goal, even reason. So I will get into these a little later. Now, in terms of the importance of motivation, there are some very general claims, say it provides a sense of purpose. It allows one to function productively, to maintain well-being, and so on. And it's a basis of improved work performance and other performance. It even represents something unique about each individual. This kind of arguments can go all the way back to a long time ago. For example, you can trace them back to, say, William James, Henry Murray, and so on. And there are also some evidence emerging recently from our own work. For example, Bratz and Son 2018 shows the importance of motivation in accounting for moral judgment. Son et al. 2022 shows the importance of motivation in many other circumstances. And my collaborator have shown empirical evidence, the importance of motivation, even in intelligence tests. Intelligence tests are supposed to be a pure measure of intelligence, but actually motivation plays a significant role in it. More importantly, without motivation, people would be aimless and mindlessly wandering, because they would not have a clear goal, or they have randomly set goals that are randomly changing. So their behavior will be disorganized and haphazard. Now, in experimental psychology, motivation is often measured by one of several things. One is effort expenditure or effort allocation. The higher the effort one allocates to a task, the higher the motivation that person has. Or by self-setting of goals. The higher a goal one sets, the higher the motivation. For example, in industrial organizational psychology, in educational psychology, and so on, that was the measure. In computational psychology or computational cognitive modeling, on the other hand, motivation is often simply represented by a data structure called goal or goal stack, for example, in many cognitive architectures. Neither approach is addressing fundamental questions concerning human motivation. Both appear too superficial and too coarse-grained, so we should do better. Another possible approach is that motivation may be measured by or linked to essential or intrinsic needs or intrinsic motives, and the goal setting on that basis. I refer to the earlier definition talking about these two sets of things. This is based on a long series of work in this regard, and those intrinsic needs or intrinsic motives can be measured through well-developed instruments, for example, PRF or IMP. I will get to that later. However, this theoretical approach, unfortunately, has been very much overlooked by many other fields in psychology and in other disciplines. Or they may be only used conceptually in a superficial way, but not quantitatively or mechanistically in a precise way. For example, in educational psychology, in social psychology, and so on. In AI, people mainly dealt with one intrinsic need, which is curiosity, for example, in reinforcement learning. And that's believed to be important. But they are probably missing the bigger picture, in which there are other motives that may interact with curiosity, or a small number of motives that they are dealing with, because they may suppress, they may enhance curiosity, and so on. In terms of this notion of intrinsic needs or intrinsic motives, you can look into William James' theory of motivation, or McDougall's purposive psychology, which builds on William James' theory, or Murray's system of needs, what he called personology, or Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And more recently, Rees' 16 basic motives, and also a number of other work, among them DIC-ISC self-determination theory is well known, but they only deal with a small subset of these intrinsic needs or motives. And among them, Murray's and Rees' systems are best established. They are highly similar. For example, PRF is used to measure Murray's system of needs, and RMP, or Rees motivation profile, is for Rees' 16 basic motives. So there are many different definitions or operationalizations of the notion of motivation. And there are also many different studies and different theories from the different disciplines concerning motivation. And they are often inconsistent with each other. For example, the effects of motivation on performance have been found empirically in different disciplines. And there are many seemingly inconsistent studies, as well as many contradictory theories. One debate that is very well known is a debate between Vancouver and Bandura, but there are also other debates. So these issues need to be sorted out, and we need integration or unification of these empirical findings and empirical theories. So let's look into a theoretical framework that is the essential idea behind the Clarion cognitive architecture. For now, I won't get into the technical details. Let's just talk about the basic idea. So the issues concerning motivation are complex and multifaceted. So cognitive architecture can help shed light on these issues. On the other hand, for cognitive architecture research, it's a chance to tackle something new. And that something new is also fundamental importance. It goes beyond the narrow notion of cognition by exploring motivation, metacognition, and so on and so forth. And also to go beyond just the goal stack in computational model. It has not been usual for cognitive architecture to address issues concerning motivation. In general, it has been unusual for cognitive architecture to deal with issues from motivational psychology, social psychology, IO psychology, educational psychology, and so on. So this could be an interesting opportunity for cognitive architecture research. But first of all, what is a cognitive architecture? Actually, I forgot, you recently had a few talks on cognitive architecture, so let me just speed through this part. A cognitive architecture, to me, is a broadly scoped, domain-generic computational psychological model capturing the essential structures, mechanisms, representations, and processes of the mind. It provides a general framework to facilitate more detailed exploration. But it also specifies sufficient computational details of essential psychological mechanisms and processes as an integral part of the framework to begin with as an initial framework for more detailed modeling. So it enables the development of theories of psychology in computational form. So that's the idea of computational psychology. The Clarion cognitive architecture is one of them, is a dual representation cognitive architecture. It involves both symbolic and connectionist representation for capturing explicit and implicit processes, respectively, or system 2 and system 1, or whatever other terms you like to use. So it includes cognition, metacognition, motivation, and so on. It's broader in scope than most existing cognitive architectures. It includes various subsystems or modules for capturing these different aspects. As a side note, Clarion is a hybrid neurosymbolic models, the idea of which emerged in the 1990s, a long time ago. And for example, this book, Sun and Bookman, 1994, I believe that was the first book on this topic, neurosymbolic models. So now let's sketch a high-level view of the framework without any detail for the time being. At the highest level of abstraction and in relation to motivation, we can view the framework as these 3 steps. One is the motive, the activation of relevant motives from a number of factors. And then these motives led to the selection of a goal. And then with that goal in place, one selects actions to carry out to accomplish that goal. In actuality, the process is a lot more complex, but for now, we're not going to get into the detail. Now, how do we select a goal, and then how do we select an action on that basis? We need a criteria. And utility calculation provides that needed criteria. But how should utility itself be calculated? On what basis? One common option in many existing theory is that utility is determined based on expected external rewards. But that's problematic because that's not a stable basis for determining utility. Whether external rewards is rewarding or not based on the many factors, including the internal factors. For example, if one is hungry, then food is very rewarding. And if one is not hungry, then there's no incentive value. So in our framework, utility is determined mostly and fundamentally on the basis of the satisfaction of one's activated essential needs or motives. As I argued earlier about intrinsic needs. In this way, utility calculation can be placed on more solid ground. And this approach accounts for a variety of empirical phenomena in a unified way, as I will get to. Yeah, here's a list. So this approach accounts for effects of goal setting or goal priming on performance. In other words, these phenomena from IO psychology based on essential motives and the utility on that basis. And effects of self-efficacy on performance. Again, phenomenon from social and IO psychology. And personality phenomena from personality psychology. Emotion phenomena from social psychology research on emotion and so on. And also moral judgment phenomena from moral psychology and experimental philosophy and other areas. One question is explicit utility calculation necessary for each instance where a choice needs to be made? The answer is no. This is because utility calculation may be implicit and embodied in many cases, especially when it is based on intrinsic needs and motives. And the utility consideration may even be crystallized into fixed reflexes so as to avoid the cost of utility calculation on the fly. So to get to the model, we need to look into some technical details, a little bit at least. So first of all, some basic theoretical principles embodied by the Clarion cognitive architecture. I think this is the best way to introduce the cognitive architecture. First of all, is a division between procedural and declarative processes. Procedural processes deal with actions, and declarative processes deal with reasoning and information retrieval and so on and so forth. And this division is not controversial. It has been established for quite a long time. And the second is a division between implicit and explicit processes, or system one and system. This is a bit more controversial, but given the popularity of Kahneman's book popularizing this notion, it should be fairly well established by now also. But here I make two further distinctions. One is the distinction between implicit and explicit procedural processes. And the other is the distinction between implicit and explicit declarative processes. So it's a four-way partitioning. And there's the difference between symbolic versus connectionist representation. So one for capturing explicit processes and the other for implicit processes. This distinction provides a representational substrate for capturing the distinction between the implicit and explicit process. In other words, the representational difference captures the phenomenological difference or psychological or corresponding psychological phenomena. So it's a dual process, dual representation, cognitive architecture, as mentioned earlier. Furthermore, on the basis of implicit and reactive processes, they are also, as I mentioned, explicit processes, but they are also motivational control and metacognitive control. That's two very important principles. And the Carrier cognitive architecture is also extendable. For example, we in the past used convolutional neural network as a perceptual module, or large language models based on transformers and so on as a linguistic module. And I'm not going to get into that. So based on these theoretical principles, here are the four major subsystems of Carrier. One is the ACS, or action-centered subsystem, for dealing with procedural processes. Another one is NACS, or non-action-centered subsystem, for dealing with declarative processes. And a motivational subsystem for dealing with motivational processes, and a metacognitive subsystem. Within each of these subsystems, there are two levels. The top level captures explicit processes, and the bottom level captures implicit processes. And they interact constantly. And these four subsystems also interact constantly and operating in parallel. I'm going to skip those implementational details because it's not important to what I'm going to present. So I'm going to skip those. Now let's look into the motivational subsystem, or MS. Within the bottom level of the motivational subsystem, there are these drives. Among them, primary drives capture intrinsic motives or needs, as I mentioned earlier. These motives and needs are mostly evolutionarily acquired, hardwired to begin with. There are low-level primary drives, which are mostly physiological needs, food, water, and so on. And there are also high-level primary drives, which are more socially oriented. For example, affiliation, power, achievement, autonomy, deference, and so on, as argued by these authors that I cited earlier, Murray, Maslow, Rees, and so on. And these drives, or the activation of these drives, have a major impact on utility calculation, and there lies their importance. As we all know, utility is determined by benefit and cost. And according to Carrier, benefit is determined by value of goal states to be achieved. How do we calculate the value of the goal state? It's calculated by the product of the degree of satisfaction of outstanding needs, in other words, activated drives, multiplied by the strengths of these needs and drives. So in other words, the value of the goal is determined by the sum of the products of ds, drive strengths of a particular drive D, and the satisfaction of that drive D by achieving that goal G. In terms of the satisfaction, we need to distinguish between approach-oriented versus avoidance-oriented drives. Approach-oriented drives, for example, achievement has a positive satisfaction between 0 and 1. Avoidance-oriented drive has a negative satisfaction, say between -1 and 0. So they affect overall values of goal state differently, and therefore affecting utility calculation differently. And another variable is ds, drive strengths, which is determined by many internal and external factors. And so it's determined by stimulus level times deficit, where stimulus level measures the relevance of the external factors, and deficit is the internal inclination. So now we can put together the model about motivation performance relationship. I'm only going to focus on the motivation performance relationship. I'm not going to discuss other equations within CRIA, otherwise it would take hours. So concerning the motivation performance relationship, we only need these three equations. First of all, within the motivational subsystem, the drive activation or drive strength is determined by the product of stimulus level and deficit, as I mentioned earlier, with two parameters. And generally, we set the G, the scaling parameter to 1, and the B, the baseline, to 0. So with a few parameters to deal with and reduce the degree of freedom, of course. And within the metacognitive subsystem, goal strengths are calculated, which is calculated based on the weighted sum of drive strengths, where the weight is the relevance of a particular drive to a particular goal. And then the set of drive strengths for different, the set of goal strengths for different goals is transformed into a Boltzmann distribution, and one goal is selected from that distribution, in with the softmax. And then the utility of different actions or utility of different rules dictating different actions are calculated. And in this case, we are only concerned with effort allocation. So the action is a meta-level action determining how much effort to put into a task. We call it effort level. And so the utility is calculated based on the benefit of a particular effort level and the cost of a particular effort level. Cost is easy to calculate. We assume it's a linear function of effort level. And so that's the second part of the equation. And benefit is calculated based on two things. One is the value of achieving the goal, and two is the probability of achieving that goal. And the value of achieving that goal has been discussed earlier here. And the probability of achieving that goal is estimated based on a couple of factors. One is the effort level. The more effort you put into the task, the more likely you will the goal. And another factor is your confidence level. For example, self-efficacy, we'll get to that later. And the higher the confidence, the higher your subjective estimate will be. And then this set of a utility is converted into a Boltzmann distribution. And one effort level or one rule dictating an effort level is selected on that basis. Again, it's a soft maths. And this F1 is just simply a sigmoidal function because probability cannot exceed 1. So this function will limit the value to be less than 1. When the value gets very large, it will taper off. So in terms of the CRIA framework for psychological justifications of the cognitive architecture, I refer you to these representative publication among other publications, especially the 2 psych review papers, number 2 and number 3. Number 2 concerns the NACS, non-action centered subsystem, and number 3 concerns ACS, in other words, actions and skills and so on. And also the 2 cognitive science paper. Paper number 1 involves a motivational subsystem and a little bit of metacognitive subsystem also. And this book summarizes the relevant work on CRIA over different time periods. The 2016 book, the first one, is the most recent one. It has the most up-to-date details. So let's look into the question of how CRIA can help shed light on relevant empirical phenomena, provide explanation, conceptual as well as detailed mechanistic explanation. I will draw upon these papers listed here. So there have been a number of interesting empirical findings with regard to the motivation-performance relationship. For example, DIC-ISC work shows the effect of external rewards on intrinsic motivation, and other work shows the cultural difference in that regard. And Lathan and his collaborators showed the effect of different goal types on performance. And there are also work showing the effect of different feedback types. And Vancouver showed the effects of self-efficacy, contradictory to Bandola's well-known claim about self-efficacy, and so on. So there are many different, sometimes incompatible results. And we will show how they can be unified within the framework I just outlined. So let's look into an example from IO psychology. So the task in this experiment is to develop class schedules, trying to accomplish as many as possible. And the participants were divided into multiple groups, and each group were given a different goal. And we group those goals into 3 conditions. One is the outcome goal condition, where they were asked to achieve a certain performance level, number of schedules. One is a learning goal, and the other one is do your best. There's no particular specific target, just do your best. And the finding is that under the learning goal, they performed the best. And under the outcome goal, they performed the worst. And we simulate that, and the simulation results were exactly as in the human experiments. Learning goal led to the best performance, and the outcome goal led to the worst performance, and do your best goal lied somewhere in between. And here is a bar graph comparing human data and the simulation results. As you can see, it's a very good match. Now, how do we capture the human data, and what kind of interpretation does that simulation provide us? Basically, our interpretation is as follows. In this experiment, the outcome goal condition triggered more avoidance-oriented drive because it's focused on achieving high outcome. And the learning goal conditions triggered more approach-oriented drive, for example, the curiosity drive, because of its learning focus. And let's look into the satisfaction besides the goal strengths, as mentioned above. The avoidance-oriented goal were least likely satisfied in the outcome goal condition because of its high outcome demand. And the approach-oriented drives were most likely satisfied in the learning goal condition, which happens to be the condition in which the approach-oriented drives are highly activated. So as the net result is that utility values are higher under the learning goal condition than the outcome goal condition. You can plug a number into the equation and you will get that result. And therefore, people put in more effort under the learning goal condition, and therefore they perform better. So that's how we capture the human data, and that provides the interpretation for the result. So that's just one simple simulation, and it seems to be quite simple, but we can provide this kind of explanation for a large range of phenomena or experimental findings. Here's another example. I can only show a few examples. In this experiment, the task is to solve as many anagrams as possible. Participants were Asian American children and Agro-American children, as they call it. There are three conditions for each group. The personal choice condition, in which they were asked to make their own choice of a category of anagrams to solve. And experimenter's choice condition, in which the experimenter made the choice for them. And the mom choice condition, in which they were told that their mother made the choice for them. So let's look at the experimental results. As you would expect, Anglo-American children performed the best under the personal choice condition. And Asian American children performed the best under the mom's choice condition. And the difference is, of course, statistically significant. And here's our simulation results. Again, just as in the human experiments, the simulated Anglo-American children performed the best under the personal choice condition, and the simulated Asian American children performed the best under the mom's choice condition. Now, what kind of interpretation did that simulation provide us? So the general idea is Anglo-American children tend to have high activations of the autonomy drive because of a cultural conditioning, because of a cultural emphasis on autonomy. And Asian American children tend to have high activation of the deference drive, again, due to cultural conditioning. And this difference is captured by the corresponding drive deficit parameter, as I mentioned earlier. And this drive difference translates into different valuations of the COM, and therefore different utility values in each of these different three conditions. Specifically, individuals tend to choose higher effort levels for these conditions matching their drive activations. In other words, the conditions that satisfy more their drive activations, which leads to higher valuation of the goal, and therefore high utility value, and therefore higher effort level, which leads to higher performance. So that's how we interpret the simulation outcome. And that provides a general explanation for this kind of phenomena. It's not limited to this experiment. Of course, there are many similar experiments corroborating the results. And now let's move on to accounting for empirical phenomena related to self-efficacy, which is the conviction that one has that one can successfully execute the behavior required to produce the outcome, according to Bandola. It's believed to be crucial to motivation. It can be measured through questionnaires and so on. And important self-efficacy related empirical phenomena include discontinuity of the effect of self-efficacy on performance at a within-person level. Both positive and negative effects of self-efficacy are efforts within a person, and the positive effect of self-efficacy on performance at the between-person level, and a number of other effects. I'm going to skip some technical details. So let's talk about the discontinuity of the effect of self-efficacy on effort allocation at the within-person level. Some people argued, based on empirical data, discontinuity of this function, mapping self-efficacy to effort. For example, Vancouver showed this illustration of a discontinuous curve. I don't know if you can see my cursor.
Visible.
Okay, great. And so here is the outcome from our model that I just showed earlier. It's continuous, but it resembles that discontinuous shape. Now, how did we capture this shape? This is directly the result of the utility function I just presented earlier. So when the benefit is less than the cost, in other words, when the utility is in the negative range, the lowest effort level will lead to the highest utility. If you look at the linear approximation of the sigmoidal function, that's obvious. Of course, it's not necessarily always the lowest effort level because it's stochastic selection based on that Boltzmann distribution or softmax. So, but the effort level would be very low. So when the self-efficacy increase, the self-efficacy increase here, self-efficacy increase right here, then the gap between benefit and cost narrows. Therefore, increasingly higher effort level will be chosen because of stochastic selection again, with narrowing difference among utilities of different effort level. So more and more likely higher effort level will be selected. So you see the rapid rising here. Now let's look into another finding. A meta-analysis of a large number of experiments showed that they were both positive and negative effects of self-efficacy on effort at the within-person level. Some people certainly argued for inverted U-curve. And carrion curve is indeed an inverted U curve, an asymmetric inverted U curve. Now, how did the carrion equations produce this inverted U curve? We can look into the utility function again when benefit is greater than the cost. In other words, when the utility is in the positive range. So if the sigmoidal function f1 is in the rising range, in other words, this range, it's basically linear in this range. A higher self-efficacy leads to higher utility. And a higher effort level will more likely be chosen due to stochastic selection with a widening difference among utilities of different effort level. So higher and higher effort level will be chosen when self-efficacy gets higher, but up to a point only. When the self-efficacy reaches this flat region because of this sigmoidal function, with self-efficacy at this region, benefit will not increase much by a higher effort level. But cost will, because cost is a linear function of effort level. So in this case, if self-efficacy goes higher, a lower effort level becomes more desirable. So you see the downward curve here when the self-efficacy gets too high. So that explains these two effects. And at the between person level, the finding is generally that the effect of self-efficacy on performance is positive. And this can be captured by the self-efficacy learning equation, as I briefly showed earlier. It's basically a simple delta rule, as I reproduced the equation here. Alpha is the learning rate, and beta is a noise. And so the better the performance, the higher the self-efficacy. So the correlation is established that way. So the causality here is reversed. In other words, it goes from performance to self-efficacy. During the earlier explanation, the causality goes from the self-efficacy to performance. Although in this case, we can also take into account the reverse causality, in other words, from self-efficacy to performance, which Bandura emphasized, but I'm not going to get into that right now. And there are a number of other effects. I see my time is almost up, so I'm going to skip a few things. Can I have another 5 minutes or so?
Of course.
Okay, so here are some detailed simulation of experimental results. And I don't think I'm gonna get into detail here. But the point is, in Vancouver et al. 2001 experiment, they showed that at a between-person level, there is a positive correlation between performance and self-efficacy. And at the within-person level, there's a negative relation between self-efficacy and performance at the same time within the same experiment. And here's a simulation that captures exactly that, these two relations. And the explanation is similar to what I said earlier. So I'm not going to get into that. And I'm going to skip that effect, which is a effect concerning the ambiguity of feedback and how that can lead to negative effect, and how that negative effect counteract the positive between-person effect the complex dynamics between those different forces, but I'm not going to get into that. So we view simulation as theoretical and or mechanistic interpretations of experimental results in order to shed light on the underlying psychological processes and describe them in detailed computational terms. For example, in the above examples, I showed the situational factors affect performance through affecting intrinsic motives, and how deliberate manipulations of these motives affect performance through external goal settings, through personal choice, and so on. And the group difference in these motives affect the performance of different groups, and different effects of self-efficacy. And beyond that, we can also look into other domains. For example, in terms of moral judgment, we can explain data in moral judgment in the task of moral dilemma through a motivation-based account. And the basic idea is the motivational modulation of the implicit and explicit processes. So how much you rely on explicit processes is determined as a function of activation of avoidance drive. The general idea, if danger is very close, then when the activation avoidance drive is very high, then you don't want to spend time on deliberate consideration. The action will be very implicit. So that's the basic idea of accounting for moral judgment data. And similarly, we can also account for, say, self-control and self-regulation, empirical results, for example, by Hoffman and Wood and Neal and so on. And based on motivational modulation carried out by the metacognitive subsystem with utility calculation based on drive activation. And we can interpret a number of folk psychological notions on that basis, which basically can tie together the previous issues at a more theoretical level. And also, we, in the past, produced models that embody a motivational account of personality, a motivational account of emotion, and so on. For these, I refer you to this published paper, not going to get into the details. So in conclusion, while motivation is just one part of human psychology, it is an indispensable part. Humans will not function well without it. To understand the many aspects of human psychology, for example, personality, emotion, culture, morality, work performance, educational achievement, and so on, motivation has to be taken into consideration. We have shown that motivation as a factor accounts for many empirical findings and empirical phenomena, not just conceptually, but also mechanistically or computationally through detailed modeling and simulation. In this way, we provide principled interpretations of diverse range of findings in a unified way. And also, I should mention that the Clarion cognitive architecture constitutes an integrative and a comprehensive computational framework for that purpose. It encompasses many different representations and mechanisms and many different mental functionalities. It goes beyond the narrowly defined notion of cognition. And I would claim that understanding the human mind requires nothing less than such a broad, comprehensive computational framework, and maybe even broader than that. And intrinsic needs, motives, and their satisfaction, and utility calculation on that basis are crucial for this framework. Likely, we can say the same for AI. Just imagine a chat GPT that can be motivated to do certain things, not just imitating. And it has a sense of its own competence. It has its sense of self-efficacy. It has intrinsic sense of morality. It's capable of self-control, and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're now at the period of questions, and I'm going to do it differently from the usual way. Normally I break the ice, but let me just check. Nua, are you here? Okay, well, she submitted a question, so I will tell you what she asked. Is motivation innate, or is it a habit that is built on a primarily initiated forced discipline? In my experience, I'm only motivated if I've done it enough times to know I can achieve results. Is motivation innate?
Yes.
Or habit?
It's both. People have intrinsic motives, and that's likely innate. It's evolutionarily acquired. But people can also acquire secondary motives, and people can form habits. And those habits may or may not be linked to motivation. And your question also touched upon the notion of self-efficacy. That's exactly what I was talking about. You can learn about your own capabilities, and you can decide the allocation of effort on that basis. Basically, if efficacy is very low, you just give up. There's no point in trying. So here is a curve again. So when the self-efficacy is very low, you put in very little effort or no effort at all. And when self-efficacy crosses a threshold, a virtual threshold, then you put in a lot of effort because you know you can accomplish that. But if self-efficacy goes higher, then you put in less effort because you know you can accomplish it, or you think you can accomplish it without too much effort. So the higher the self-efficacy beyond that point, the less effort you put into it. So that's the theory resulting from the utility function. And that's also consistent with the empirical finding.
Nua has a second question, which is more general and which is a part of everybody else's question. What is the main limitation of this framework, Clarion, considering that there are more and more technologies that help humans to be lazier and more sedentary?
Interesting. What's the limitation of the model of the Clarion cognitive architecture? So far, I haven't found any limitation, but I found a lot of possibility of extending the framework. For example, adding the perceptual module, adding the linguistic module, and so on and so forth. Without adding this module, of course, it cannot deal with perception very well, or it cannot deal with the language very well. So it needs those extensions to deal with those. And technology making people lazier and more sedentary. Interesting. Well, one possibility is that with technology, people achieve higher self-efficacy because they believe with technology, they can achieve the goal more easily, and therefore they will put in less effort.
Okay. Jalal, I guess you're not here because Jalal usually helps me at the beginning. But he has a question, and it's a comparative question. I had some question about this too, comparing Clarion with Actar and SOAR. You mentioned that Actar and SOAR are architectures that do have sufficient motivational mechanisms compared to Clarion. However, unless I'm mistaken, one of the main weaknesses of Actar is not being able to capture the full range of cognitive processes that humans use in certain tasks due to its inability to tackle uncertainty. It does not use probabilities and uncertainty. Does it mean that Actar, Clarion, and SOAR are architectures that can only work in static environments? This is true. We say the cognitive architectures cannot be successful in real-world simulations.
I'm sorry, what were you quoting? I mean, you seem to be reading something from...
It's a question from a student, from all of the students, all of the doctoral students received your
Okay.
reference list. And,
Okay.
Some of them couldn't attend now, so they sent section.
Okay. I would characterize the difference between Clarion and Actar in that way. One thing I do agree is Actar has insufficient facilities for capturing human motivation. It basically has a goal stack, and that's it. Of course, as a general programming environment, you can program anything into it, including intrinsic needs and so on and so forth. But that's not the inherent or intrinsic part of the cognitive architecture. And about these other things, dynamic, static, I don't quite understand. I wouldn't characterize the difference that way.
Okay. Sila, are you here? Okay, I'll do Sila's question as well. But in the meanwhile, of course, anybody who's here or out there can chime in with their own questions, if you wish. Just speak into your microphone. But from Sila, how does this cognitive architecture explain the relation between motivation, intrinsic needs, objectives, and effort in performance? What is the relation between those variables?
The relation between these variables that's captured by these it's captured by these three equations. In other words, the intrinsic needs is captured by the activation of drive strengths, which is determined by two things. One is the external factors, that's the task conditions, and one is the internal factor, which is a deficit, internal inclination towards activating a certain drive. And so that's the internal needs, motives, and external factors that decides the drive strengths. And the drive strengths affects the utility calculation through the value, which is determined by here, drive strengths times the satisfaction or expected satisfaction. And therefore, different utility value for different effort level, because the effort level along with the drive strength determines the utility value. And then the selection of action is based on utility value. So these three equations, plus of course, the calculation of the value of G, tie all of them together. So the relationship is quite complex, and these different curves that I've shown so far is the different aspects of this relationship, and they are all captured within these three simple equations.
Thank you. Sila's other two questions were actually, these questions were based on the readings, and so you've answered some of them in your talk about how it differs from other models and also applying it. So the next question is from Sofiane. Are you there? No. All right. No, I think I'll skip this question. To ask why is it so the relationship between motivation and performance so complex? Well, your equations show why it's so complex. I'll skip that.
And empirical data show it's very complex.
Very good. Now, Stéphane Samson, just to say.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Yes. In the meantime, can I have?
Yes, go ahead, Mario. Go ahead.
Yes. First, thank you so much for this beautiful presentation. I just want to ask you, can you give us more details how the experiment happens? Like what will go on? For example, in the anagram experiment, you give the questions to the audience, to the people, and then with Clarion, how do you do it? Like on its own, it does its answering, like you give it the question, is it operated by a human? Like how it's the setup, how is it done?
Okay, I think you are referring to this experiment. Solving anagrams. Yeah, in this
yes, exactly.
they present
yeah. For example, this one, yes.
Yeah. In this case, they present each children anagrams and ask them to solve them. And as far as I remember, they give them a bunch of these anagrams and ask them to go over them, over as many as possible.
Sorry to interrupt you. It's okay, maybe not this experiment, any other experiment, like any other experiment. Usually, how is it done from the Clarion side? Like
okay, the simulation.
Exactly, yes.
Okay, interesting. Let's see. Let me try to remember. It's been a while. The paper was published 2022. That means the paper was written 2020 or earlier. So let me see. Let me try to remember. The model is mostly about a meta-level action, in which effort allocation. So the model simulates a task at very high level. So it determines the effort level for each simulated participant. And generally speaking, number of anagrams solved is a function of amount of time you allocate to the task, at least at a within person level. And so the simulation basically determined the number of anagrams solved based on the amount of time allocated. So it's a simulation at a very high level.
Okay.
Got it, Mario?
Yeah, that's good. I have another question also. Just what is the relation, because when you talked about utility and expectations, I got the idea, like how is it related to neuroeconomics and decision making, like the race model and this kind of stuff? Is it related? It is not related, or and if yes, how is it related?
That's an interesting question. I looked into very early on, a long time ago, neuroeconomics and that sort of thing. They dealt with mostly time discounting and these things. In other words, it's not really related to the kind of issues that I addressed here. If I'm not mistaken, maybe more recently, say the past year or this year, they have done some work similar to this work. I'm not sure, but I haven't seen anything that's very relevant to this work. In other words, they deal with different issues.
Well, you could take the question in the reverse.
Very good. Thank you so much for the explanation and the beautiful presentation once again. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Ron, you could actually take that question to be the reverse, which is not how does Clarion apply to that? Pardon me, not how does that apply to Clarion, but how would Clarion apply what neuroeconomics is concerned with?
Okay.
You call it a unified architecture, and
Yeah.
many of the
I'm
questions
looking
you're
to
asking about,
different psychological branches. Neuroeconomics was not one of these. As I said earlier, my earlier quick look at neuroeconomics shows that there's nothing particularly relevant to me, but I could be mistaken, so I could look into that again. In terms of dealing with the temporal discounting and things like that, currently we don't deal with temporal discounting. In other words, we are dealing with almost instantaneous incentive. So we're not dealing with that particular aspects. So it cannot be applied to that aspect without extension of the model. Can the model be extended to deal with that? I'm pretty sure we can. But right now we are not dealing with that. It depends on the funding situation. Whatever the funding source wants us to focus on, we'll focus on that. Our funding source wants us to focus on IO psychology and maybe a little bit of social psychology. So that's what we've been working on.
do you take it to be good news or bad news if your model turns out to apply to everything?
Apply to everything on that's not the danger that we are currently facing. In other words, they are too much out there, and for dealing with many other aspects, we need to expand the model significantly. For example, the temporal discounting I just mentioned, you just mentioned. So there's a lot of work to do. I'm not too worried about it can account for everything.
It was a hypothetical question. If it did, would that be good news?
Yes, it will be, but it's highly, highly unlikely.
What's behind the effect that a model like this, which is a theoretical model, applies to everything, is that if there's, especially except if it's famous for making predictions that other people didn't expect and they were right, it risks becoming a hermeneutic model where it's just an interpretation which fits everything.
Yeah, that's a legitimate question. However, if you look at the model, especially if you look at the simulation of, say, self-efficacy, the parameters are very, very few parameters. How many parameters? 2 or 3, if I remember correctly. So it's very almost parameter-free, I would say, because these parameters didn't really change across simulations. So it's the emergent results of the equation itself with very few parameters. Of course, in terms of the simulation of these the earlier experiments, you need to treat those drive activation as a parameter. So if you have 2 drives involved in simulation, then you have at least 2 additional parameters added to it. But that's not that many parameters. And also, what was that thinking? Also, the exact value of these parameters don't matter. What's most important is the relative ordering of these parameter values. For example, let me see if I can find, oh yeah, the Anglo-American children tend to have a higher activation of autonomy drive than the Asian American children. So as long as that ordering is there, you get the similar kind of simulation results. And that's absolutely not unreasonable assumption, that ordering, that particular ordering. And so I would say the model actually captures some underlying regularity. Therefore, based on a simple set of equations, it can capture a large number of empirical phenomena. Not all, at least not yet. So it seemed to suggest that some underlying regularity were captured by our model.
Okay, actually, that was not my most provocative question. That one's going to come in a minute. We're running out of time, but first I want to ask Pierre Vadnet if he wants to ask his question. Turn on your microphone.
And to me?
Okay. Very interesting presentation. Your model is very special. But I would have a few questions to ask if you could go back to the page with your 3 equations. Yes. Okay. In there has to be some relations somewhere given between some relation between, for example, effort level and stimulus level, and effort level and deficit. Where are these relationships coming from? Or how much data do you have to provide to the system to establish these relationships?
Okay, the relationship is captured by the utility function here through the value function. And as a reminder, the value function is determined by the drive strength and its satisfaction, and drive strength is determined by the deficit. So that's how the utility function is determined based on the deficit and the stimulus level, and also by effort level, and by self-efficacy. The CL here is self-efficacy.
Yes, but the deficit implies a need, and somewhere you have to measure that need or that deficit.
Yeah,
How
you
do
can measure those.
that?
You can measure those deficits based on some very well established instruments, as psychologists call them, in other words, questionnaires. For example, I mentioned the 2 of them earlier. Let me get to that. Yeah, PRF, that stands for Personality Research Form. That measures Murray's system. And the other one is RMP, which stands for Reese Motivational Profile, which measures Reese system.
But then the numbers that come out of there, they're already giving the answer to the motivation, aren't they? Like it's like you're measuring some some sub-information to be able to calculate and really, to me, I don't see how you measure the basic need. Okay, let's be clear. I'm an engineer and I work with robots. And my problem is the robot has absolutely no basic need unless I define it as being how much energy it has available and things like this. But anything that is living has some basic needs that are the base of the motivation. Or maybe I'm wrong.
Yes, yes, absolutely. I mean, even a robot can have built-in motivation. For example, it needs to survive, which means it needs to get enough energy and need to get self-repaired if it breaks down. And it also may have built-in needs to accomplish tasks correctly. That means putting in effort sufficient to accomplish the task, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, these are artificial needs that I can put in the robot. But for living things, that there is something else. There is a basic
It's put in
need.
by God, yes.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Metaphorically
By God, fine. I have no more questions.
Okay. Basically, it's formed inside individuals through evolution, and it's mostly innate. You are born with those needs.
So we can forget about artificial intelligence.
No, you can have built into it. And I remember some researcher did experiments that through evolutionary simulation, they form agents that have intrinsic needs. My group also did this kind of a simulation, the multi-agent simulation on social simulation, as we call it, as people call it in that community. Through that kind of simulation, you acquire certain intrinsic, innate motivation in order to help the survival of the species and also the individual.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, you give up too easily. Okay.
No.
You led it into the question I want to ask, and you partly answered it. Since February or since March, none of these talks have been free of some allusion to ChatGPT, okay? And you made it yourself as well. So the original question I was going to ask you was about what you said about ChatGPT's motivation, which on the face of it sounds absurd, but you're saying that it's not absurd even in the case of a robot, because all that's happening in a robot is whatever constraints we built into it become its intrinsic motivation. And you said by God you meant evolution. In the case of humans, it's the same with organisms. It's the same thing. Evolution puts in motivations, but the form in which evolution puts motivations in, for example, the predilection that children have for sugar, sweets, too much of a predilection. That's a motivation which they have, which for evolutionary reasons, the official story is that in the original ancestral environment, there was very little sweets available and lots of predators, and you had to have some sort of a system that made the organism want to eat as much sugar as they could when it was available. If you didn't have that motivation, you would have died. I mean, your genes that told you never mind the sugar would have gotten you. Okay, but the vector for that, it's easy to say. Robots have that, organisms have that, software has that. The vector for that was actually feeling. Motivation is felt. It's not just a functional property that you can formally put into a system. It has to be felt. Can you imagine the ChatGPT, such as it is, the transformer and the database, et cetera, or Pierre's robots? feel motivation? If it's not felt, it's neither extrinsic nor intrinsic. It's no kind of motivation at all.
Okay, now we are getting into Chalmers' two kinds of consciousness. One is access consciousness, and the other one is the feeling, the qualia of consciousness. And well, nobody has any solution to the second one, and people can only deal with. I mean, in terms of building robots or computational models for simulation or whatever, people can only deal with access consciousness, which is a functional process.
And then, therefore, no kind of consciousness at all. There is no access consciousness. It's function.
Well, it is an aspect of consciousness. Even access consciousness is consciousness, but it's not a complete picture of consciousness. According to Chalmers and many other people, seem to be a well-established conventional wisdom. But I mean, to get qualia and so on, that's beyond all the current understanding. Nobody has any solution. If somebody claims to have a solution, that's most likely
wrong,
bogus.
Yes, I agree with it.
But that doesn't mean you cannot have a feeling or emotion. It depends on what you mean by feeling and emotion, whether it involves qualia and so on.
Yes. Anyway, we don't have the time to resolve this, but I want to suggest that Chalmers's dichotomy is not, and in fact, it's Ned Block's dichotomy, is not the one to cite to answer the question, how can you have intrinsic motivation that is unfelt? That is not the way to answer it, because it makes it seem as if there's some other shadowy substance that can give motivation that isn't felt. And as a first natural assumption, it is that what we mean by motivation, whether we're talking about animals, about robots, about people, is something that's felt. If the entity is not an entity that can feel anything, then your answer, which is that access consciousness is another aspect of consciousness, the first thing that it needs, which is the feeling, it doesn't have. And therefore, we're using words in a different way when we talk about motivation.
I'm not sure. Feeling, as you call it, is necessary to have intrinsic motivation. I really don't believe that's necessary. Let me see. This is an interesting question. Now we are getting to the philosophical realm.
No, we're in the biological realm. Animals really do feel. Humans really do feel. And when we talk about the motivation,
you believe you feel.
And,
yeah.
And this is the Turing argument of consciousness, by the way.
What do you mean?
I'm sorry, what is Turing's
argument? This is called Turing argument of consciousness, because when he says if an entity doesn't feel, it's not conscious, and we will not be able to answer this question if it is feeling or
many
not
people
feeling.
argue that
So
way.
it's phenomenological, but it's
Yes,
called
many people
Turing
argue that
argument of consciousness. Yes.
Yeah. He called it, Ned Block and Chalmers call it phenomenal consciousness. Yes.
Exactly, phenomenological, right?
Yeah. There are many people argue that way, but there are also many people argue the other way around. In other words, qualia is epiphenomenal. It's not necessary part, especially for motivation or intrinsic motivation. It's not necessary part. Many people would argue that. I'm not sure myself, but I would tend to agree with the latter. In other words, it may not be necessary. It may be there for humans and for some animals, but it may not be necessary.
This is called the hard problem, and we're not going to be able to solve it here now. So, but what's easier?
The
for
hard
me to
problem
do-
of intrinsic motives.
Yes.
In analogy to Chalmers, the hard problem of consciousness.
But we've run out of time, so I have the easier problem of thanking you for a very stimulating talk, and thanking everyone for attending.
Thank you so much.
The talk will be available online tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Professor Sun.